Not bad, thanks. Thanks for making time for us again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I guess you've gone through a bit of a transformation recently, I think, from being, a psychologist at the University of Toronto to being sort of a celebrated author and a celebrity and someone who has a huge following online. I wonder just briefly if you could tell me a bit about how that transition has been for you.
Well, it's gone from rocky to quite good. I mean, initially, when I made my first videos, it was rocky because my job was at risk and perhaps my practice as a clinician as well. But as this has progressed over the last year and a half, it's become increasingly positive. And I think the reason for that is because what I'm saying is being listened to by lots of people, and it's not fundamentally a political message.
Justin Trudeau once tweeted out earlier this year, "It's incredibly inspiring and motivating to see so many people come out to support women's rights. We see you, we hear you, and Maryam Monsef and our government will keep fighting for gender equality in Canada. Hashtag Women's March 2018. Your response to that tweet was, "Is that the murderous equity doctrine, Justin Trudeau? Do you understand where that leads?
Yeah.
Or do you think you'll do it differently?"
Sure.
My question is, sometimes I read things you write and they seem to incite the sort of toxicity we see on the internet that you seem on some level to want to avoid. You seem to want people to live their best possible lives. And then when I see tweets like that or hear some of the speech you use sometimes, it feels opposed to that self-betterment.
I think that's because, with all due respect, that you fail to understand the danger of the equity doctrine. Look at it this way. In the 20th century, we saw mass murders take place on the right and the left. And we have some sense of when the right goes too far. Now, we know perfectly well that in the 20th century on the left, about 100 million people were killed in the name of political repression. But we don't have any clear guidelines for deciding when people on the left go too far, although clearly they can go far. And my study of totalitarianism, both on the right and the left, has indicated that the left go too far when they start to push equity doctrines. And so you might think that all that Trudeau's doing is trying to be nice to women, but I see something far darker underneath that. And with all due respect, I suspect I'm more informed about that particular element of history than you are.
That might be fair, but I feel like with all due respect, you might incite more hateful feelings on the internet than I do, too.
It's possible, but I would also take issue with that. I think that the bulk consequence of what I've done so far is that I've convinced thousands of young men to stay away from the alt-right, for example, and move them much more towards an individual sovereignty and liberal position.
I want to talk about oppression for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm going to play a little clip here from one of your lectures so that we're really grounded in what you said.
You're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed. God only knows why. Maybe you're too short, or you're not as beautiful as you could be, or, your grandparent was a serf, likely, because almost everybody's great-grandparent was. It's like, and you're not as smart as you could be, and you have a sick relative, and you have your own physical problems, and it's like, frankly, you're a mess. And you're oppressed in every possible way, including your ancestry and your biology. And the entire sum of human history has conspired to produce victimized you with all your individual pathological problems. It's like, yes, true.
Do you ever worry that saying something like that might create a false equivalency between different kinds of oppression?
No, because I'm not willing to view the world through the oppression identity politics lens. And I think the fact that we do that virtually reflexively now is extraordinarily dangerous. And even if there are ethnic differences in historical oppression on some timescales, which is undoubtedly true, that doesn't mean that we divide people into tribes now and we assign blame for those historical inequities. All it'll do is tribalize us, and you can see that happening like mad in the West and in Europe right now. It's very dangerous.
I grew up in Toronto, and I'm just speaking from the perspective of someone who experienced, sort of systemic racial prejudice everywhere I went. That's my framework. I don't know if it's neo-Marxism or postmodernism or if it's just my reality.
I mean, there is obviously there's arbitrary obstacles standing in people's way. Some of those have to do with gender. Some of them have to do with race and prejudice and bias and all that. But the landscape around us with regards to those things is improving very rapidly. It's much better than it has been in the past. And I still think that the proper way to construe the situation is to look to yourself as an individual.
Don't you think that that worldview doesn't necessarily apply to every situation? I mean, you're saying we're doing better, but, you know, New York's doing better than Alabama. Toronto's doing better than Wisconsin. There's just any number of experiences there that you're not really considering.
Yeah, but Alabama is doing a lot better than Alabama was 30 years ago. The fact that there are still places where prejudice is a problem is self-evident. People are tribal by nature, but we don't contend with it by turning to an identity politics view of the world. It's not going to help, and I see Trudeau doing that all the time. To return to your initial question, I don't think he has any idea what sort of fire he's playing with.
When I see that tweet from Justin Trudeau, I see a guy who's saying, like, hey, it's great to see all these women out in solidarity supporting equal rights for women. And
he wasn't supporting equal rights. He was supporting equality of outcome. And he was the same person who formulated his cabinet. It was one of his first acts as leader to ensure that his cabinet was 50% women and 50% men, despite the fact that only 25% of the elected people were women. He selected his cabinet on the basis of their genitalia. That's not an appropriate use of discriminative power. It's not the way you select competent people.
But Jordan, haven't men been selecting cabinets based on genitalia for like centuries?
No, I think that's an insane way of looking at the world. I really do believe that. You know, you really think that the right way to look at the world, the entire history of the world, that was up until we became enlightened in like the year 2000, what men were primarily doing was oppressing women.
I don't think women were even allowed to be in these rooms for much of the entire history of the world.
You accept this oppression narrative without question. You know, 120
I
years
don't.
ago,
I don't accept anything without question. I'm just telling you a fact.
That's not a fact.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Women were expected to stay home and take care of the kids and cook a meal.
Women didn't have reliable birth control until 1960. You know, don't you think that played a role? Don't you think the fact that they didn't have reliable care for
Are you
their
blaming women
cycles,
for not being allowed to lead countries, to lead nations? Because they didn't
They were allowed to lead nations. There were queens in many countries. I think you have no idea how much this oppression narrative has saturated your thinking. Even though it's self-evident that what happened for most of human history was that men and women were terribly oppressed by the conditions of nature and not by each other.
Do you think, is it not true that in the United States and Canada, at least, women weren't allowed to vote until much later than men? They weren't allowed to hold elected...
What's your point? Do you think that was merely a consequence of men's oppression of women? You think that's the only causal factor at play?
No, I mean, my point is that to see Justin Trudeau say, I'm going to make a point of appointing a cabinet that's equally male and female might just be Justin Trudeau saying, like, wouldn't it be nice to have women in the room?
Yeah, it might be, but it might be his absolute naivety and his swallowing of the victimization narrative and his inability to properly formulate a cabinet because he didn't want to do the difficult decision-making and would rather look good on a virtue signaling basis, too.
I agree.
So you can have your viewpoint of it, and I can have mine. We'll see how it plays out.
I'm a person of color. I went to college with a white man. We shared a bedroom. We were very close. We were roommates, and you know, he had a pretty tough childhood, and he would often lament that the university we went to considered a person of color's story more compelling than his. And I would sometimes find it difficult to have that conversation with him because I too felt like a person of color's story in a country that, you know, practiced slavery for a very long time was pretty compelling.
What percentage of Eastern Europeans were serfs before 1880?
I don't have that information with me right now.
Right. Well, it's a relevant piece of information if you're going to talk about historical inequality. I mean, like I said, the past is absolutely dreadful, and most people lived under absolutely brutal conditions.
Are you kind of saying like everyone's been a slave at some point?
Well, read your history and find out. That isn't what I'm saying. That's how it was.
It just feels like a little slippery because then everyone's always on the same playing field, and that's just not the reality of our society.
It's your theory, but it's not mine. There's some systemic bias in favor of the majority in all countries, and that accounts for a proportion of people's failure and success, but it certainly doesn't account for all of it. And yes, the farther back you look in history, the more terrible you find people's situations to be. And if you're going to bring all that forward into the future in the form of guilt, there's going to be real hell to pay.